Hi there, welcome back to English 75A. Today I'll be giving you a little bit of background on Walt Whitman, very influential 19th century American poet who ripples of influence continue on through the 20th into the 21st century. So he really helped to refashion how people thought about poetry. He was born in a very modest family on Long Island. Now, for those of you that may not be too familiar with New York geography, Long Island is this kind of cigar-shaped island that juts out just to the east of where Manhattan is. And again, it was a very modest place back then. Now, he had a very interesting young life, and Whitman leaves school at 11. He's working for newspapers all around Brooklyn and Manhattan until 16. So he's already getting into the business. You might recall from an earlier lecture that I talked about how difficult it was for American writers to make a living just off of their poetry or their fiction. So a lot of them also had another kind of writing racket going on, and journalism certainly filled that bill. Now, another important thing to know about his background is that he was very involved in the Free Soil Party, which was an activist electoral party that believed that slavery should be outlawed in all states, and that no new state should be admitted to the Union if they supported slavery. And he also worked as a hospital attendant during the Civil War. If you remember some of those drum taps poems that I had you skim through, they're very, very exciting about the prospect of going to war. And his tone and the way he addresses the subject matter changes after this time he spends as a hospital attendant. Very, very gruesome war. We're talking pre-anesthetic, so all kinds of horrific carnage. Now, what Waltman does is create this whole new way for people to look at poetry, and he does that by taking the rules and the standards of his day and just throwing them out the window. So part of it was his subject matter. He not only writes about nature and the human spirit, and we've seen some of that already. Those are some of the earliest topics to be used in poetry. Nature and what it means to be a human being, what nature's relationship is to the soul. But he also talks about the human body and about sexuality. Now, this is a really big deal because this is not a topic that is considered to be worthy of art, let alone public discussion. And he basically, acknowledges that sexuality exists and that he is a sexual being. And that doesn't mean that he's broken or sinful or fallen for having this almost divine sense of what it means to be a person with sexuality. Most critics at this point, I believe, think that he was bisexual, leaning towards homosexual. But there is a little bit of discussion on that still. But again, just even talking about sexuality is a huge, huge break in poetic and public tradition. Now, that's a little bit on that content side. On the structural side, he's throwing the ideas of meter and rhyme out the window and creating what we will call free verse. In other words, there's no regular rhythm and there's no regular rhyming scheme. Sometimes it happens to fold its way in, but in a lot of ways it doesn't happen. Now, a lot of you know from Leaves of Grass, especially Song of Myself, that he loves to make long, beautiful, descriptive lines and also huge lists. And those become two of his kind of structural hallmarks. So, thinking about these two innovations, content, talking about everybody's day-to-day lives, not only people who went to college and are educated and are clerks, but people who work. Putting that aligned with other topics of nature and the divine sense of sexuality. And by making it have an open structure, he's really broadening the audience of who should be reading poetry. It can be for people who are working too, not just people who have a very high level of education at this time. So in a way, he's popularizing it. And moving right along. The book that really cements his reputation as a poet is Leaves of Grass. And it comes out right before the Civil War to no huge fanfare. In fact, it was slammed for being obscene, but what they considered obscene was just talking about anything that dealt with human sexuality. Um, if it wasn't about how that person was fallen or sinful or immoral, you really couldn't have it in there. But despite him having that backlash, he does get a lot of the important readers and writers of his age on board with this new kind of poetic vision he has. And we're going to notice some of these names. We got, of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Um, became a very big fan of his work. Longfellow, another important American nature poet, doesn't get read quite as often as he used to. Um, Alfred Lord Tennyson, remember he's a second generation romantic poet from England, and Oscar Wilde. So if you're going to have people approve of your work, that's a pretty good list. And like I said before, his structure and his subject matter continue to influence this very wide and free palette that we have for poetry today. And if you notice here, like into the early 20th century, his structure and content influences people like Hart Crane and Langston Hughes. Um, Langston Hughes from the Harlem Renaissance, Allen Ginsberg from the Beat movement in the 50s and 60s, Cherie Moraga, a Latinx poet, Kathy Acker, a lesbian punk poet from the 80s, excuse me, and Pablo Neruda, a very important South American poet. So he continues to have this influential ripple. Now, other thing I want to talk about is like the way he's promoting himself and his image. And here is the frontispiece for the 1855 version of Leaves of Grass that had Song of Myself. And we've talked about portraits, right? And how important portraiture is to establishing somebody as a writer, a creator of literature. And we've seen other of these frontispieces in the past. This tiny one of Walt Whitman with one of his hands on his hips, wearing a working man's shirt, it's very, very different than what we've seen before. So yeah, he's wearing like regular working man's clothing, and notice how he's staring straight at the reader. He's not like gazing off 3/4 into the middle distance or something like that. There's a certain uh, addressing or hailing notion to this picture here. And this kind of fits in with his poetry too. He is constantly talking to the reader about his poetry, and about being an American, about being a human being. Here's the little quotation on the bottom here. Walt Whitman, From Life, One Hot July Forenoon, 1855, Brooklyn, New York. So again, it's a very, very different kind of picture. And again, this is somebody that we read not too long ago, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now look how writerly and portrait-like this looks. And I had another picture, but I guess it didn't come in here. But I'll go back and show you. And think about how different this picture of Whitman is. Again, it's of his body. It's not just of his like neck and bust up. And once again, he's got that confrontational, some people say inviting stare into the camera. So again, he's creating something very, very different for his readers there. And as you know, from having done some of the reading of Whitman already, that he loves to talk about nature. And he also loves to talk about everyday Americans, and there will be long lists of people just doing their things in the streets. And what you will notice is a lack of judgment, a lack of moral evaluation of people based on their particular offenses. So he's got this idea that everybody who's a human being is divine in a way, and even the criminals are, and even those who have fallen on the wrong side of the war, even those who are in asylums, even those who are going to be executed. So he's erasing this barrier of judgment between himself and other people. And he keeps on encouraging us to do that as well. So in a way, it's a very new kind of voice, and it's very, very different from what we saw with the Puritans, if you remember back that far. You will probably also notice there are points where he talks about religion and spirituality in a very pluralistic way. There's a whole epic catalog where he actually talks about himself being the different deities of the past, whether he is lithographing Odin onto himself, or Jesus, or Allah, or the Brahma tradition from Buddhism. And he's saying all of these traditions are about the same kind of idea, which is there is a spirituality that and a divineness that connects all human beings with themselves and nature. So it's a really fun read, I think. I know it's going to be confusing at points, and that's okay. You just have to read right through the confusion. Um, that puts us just about at time here, but I will be around all this week. Feel free to text me if you've got any questions. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you soon.